all of you for coming today. My name is Andres Martinez. I'm the director of the Bernard Schwartz Fellows Program here at New America. And this is sort of the George Kennan sweepstakes week here at New America because we're trying to discern if there is such a thing emerging as an Obama Doctrine. And we have a terrific panel here to discuss this. But before we start, I also want to plug the fact that tomorrow, Steve Clemens, who's the godfather of all things foreign here at New America, as you know, who is streaming this event on the Washington Note as well, he will be moderating a discussion with one of our other fellows, Nicholas Thompson, who wrote a biography, a sort of co-biography of Paul Nitze and George Kennan, which is a terrific book, and maybe some of you have read it, Hawk and Dove. And that discussion is going to be entitled, Where Have America's Grand Strategists Gone? So that's assuming that the takeaway from today is that maybe they're not present, but maybe that will change. So I want to quickly introduce our panel today. Peter Beinart is a senior Schwartz Fellow here at New America. He writes for Time and the Daily Beast. He's teaching at the City University of New York. And his latest book, The Icarus Syndrome, is an examination of hubris in American foreign policy that'll be due out next summer. Glenn Kessler is a diplomatic correspondent for the Washington Post, where he has worked for almost a decade. In 2007, he published the book Confidant, a biography of then Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. David Sanger is currently the chief Washington correspondent at the New York Times, and as I'm sure all of you know, he's reported extensively from Asia and has covered several administrations and the White House. He is the author of The Inheritance, The World Obama Confronts and the Challenges to American Power, which I guess was out last year?
This year.
This year. Yeah, I guess I've moved on to 2010.
Well, it's in paperback.
That's right. Next year in paperback.
Paperback's about to come out, so be sure to buy that. So this is a very timely discussion, as it turns out, given we have the twin recent major speeches by President Obama. First, his framing of the Afghan strategy at West Point, and then the Oslo speech for the Nobel Peace Prize. So with that, I think I will first, we will leave time, by the way, towards the end for your interventions and questions. But I first want to ask Peter to try to help us out in describing whether or not we have a bumper sticker of an Obama Doctrine emerging here from these two speeches and from what's now, closing in on the first year of the Obama presidency. There's been a lot of talk of limits, and you talked in your recent Time magazine piece about the downsizing of the war on terror. So what are your thoughts on the Obama Doctrine?
Well, whether presidents really have doctrines or not, journalists always say presidents have doctrines. Charles Krauthammer said that Reagan had this Reagan doctrine of trying to fight aid anti-communist rebels in the Third World. The Reagan administration denied it, but it was good for Krauthammer, so whether it was true for the Reagan administration or not. So in some ways, if you say a president doesn't have a doctrine, he may not have a doctrine, but journalists will continue to give him doctrines, and sometimes they'll take on a life of their own. For me, what's really significant about Obama's foreign policy is the moment that he takes over. That we spend probably too much time focusing on kind of biographical understandings of someone's foreign policy, what they bring to the office based on their experience, and not enough on the structural situation they find. And it seems to me that you can start to understand the Obama foreign policy by understanding that he takes office at a time when American foreign policy is more insolvent than it's been certainly since the 1970s. And solvency is this idea that Walter Lippmann had in 1943, that basically a nation's foreign policy, like its finances, must be solvent. Just like you must have more money in your bank account than you have expenses, you must have more power than you have commitments. And when you are insolvent, when you have more commitments than power, that can't sustain itself forever. sooner or later, you basically have to you have to downsize your commitments or raise your power. I think Obama's ability to increase America's power is really very, very limited. He's increased America's popularity, but his ability to increase America's economic or military power or ideological hegemony, I think, is very limited. And so I think he's being forced, essentially, to try to downsize the set of commitments that the Bush administration set out. Not just military commitments in Iraq and Afghanistan, gradually reducing American troops in Iraq and ratcheting back the definition of what victory would be in Afghanistan, such that we no longer define victory as having vanquished the Taliban. But more than that, I think what was so striking about Bush's foreign policy was how broadly he defined the war on terror. It was not just a struggle against al-Qaeda. It was a struggle against al-Qaeda and Iraq and Iran and Syria and the Taliban and Hezbollah and Hamas. It was really basically a struggle of the United States against all anti-American movements and regimes in the Middle East, the greater Middle East. And I think just as containment by the mid-1970s, by the early 1970s, had become too broad a doctrine for America to be able to execute. We learned in Vietnam that we could not stop every communist movement from taking power everywhere in the world, so that Nixon and Ford and then Carter in various ways had to try to reduce our set of ideological expectations about what we were doing in the Cold War because we were exceeding our power. Our foreign policy was insolvent. I think essentially what Obama is doing is, this is what I argue in the article, he's trying to downsize the war on terror back to a struggle against al-Qaeda and ultimately al-Qaeda alone. He can't get there overnight, but I think the ultimate goal would be basically to find different ways of dealing with these other regimes and movements such that we did not define our strategy vis-a-vis them as having to overthrow them or eliminate them, because we actually don't have the money or the military muscle to do that.
David, in the last few days you've written a couple of pieces on this subject, and I think you suggest that the president and this administration, they're inching up to having a doctrine, and I think you referred to this as an inflection point. But you seemed skeptical that there is an all-encompassing doctrine that could describe the administration's approach to the world. But you've covered a lot of administrations, and to Peter's point, we journalists want there to be a bumper sticker slogan that we can apply to presidents. But presidents do too. They, David Cholette's book about America Between the Wars describes President Clinton's frustration in the 90s to not be able to come up with the successor to containment. And, it took 9/11 and the Bush administration to try to come up with something equally broad. Peter's described some of the downsides to that. But where do you see this heading?
Well, Andres, I agree with Peter that reporters desperately want to call everything a doctrine. There are only two groups that have more of an interest in doing that, and one of them is your old profession of editorial writers. They definitely need to see a doctrine so they have something to rail against. And the third one is think tanks. So we're three-time losers up here in the doctrine world. What I've argued is that what we've begun to see is an Obama consciousness, and we have seen him, as you would expect for President Obama, to subdivide the problem. But I don't think that we have seen something yet that we could call an Obama doctrine. And I remind you that even for President Bush, what we have now come to call the Bush Doctrine, though there are many different definitions, didn't really come to pass until late 2002, fall of 2002, just about a year after 9/11, when they turned out the new national security strategy of the United States, which is what contained the preemption sections and all that. So based on that, we could give President Obama, another year before he even got to the point where we were declaring an equivalent Bush doctrine. Those two speeches that you mentioned at the beginning, the speech on Afghanistan and Pakistan, and then the Oslo speech, I thought were in many ways quite different, even though they circled around the same point. The Afghanistan-Pakistan speech was very much, as Peter has suggested, about limits. He explicitly says at the end of the speech that we have to measure our commitments against the budgetary realities. And he said, the fact of the matter is, our power is measured in part on our economic solvency. Forget the foreign policy solvency. And that there is a trade-off. He did a sort of guns and butter routine at the end of the speech that is worth going back and reading, because I think he believes this pretty firmly. And in fact, that's what took him from an August speech where he referred to Afghanistan as a war of necessity, and the way we would tend to view a war of necessity is something that you fight at all costs, and you don't even ask the question, could somebody please do a price tag on this, to where we saw the end of the Afghan review, which is when he has the head of the Office of Management and Budget come sit at the table in the Situation Room and be photographed sitting at the table in the Situation Room to make it clear that he's trying to come up with an affordable way of fighting this war. When I went back and asked the question at the White House, how do you fight a war of necessity but say that we are going to begin to pull troops out no matter what in 2 years, and here's what we think the budget will be, and we, so forth and so on, the answer I got back was, well, the war of necessity is only against al-Qaeda. The war against the Taliban, the rest of Afghanistan, securing Afghanistan, is not a war of necessity. It's just a degrading of the force. So you're already beginning to see them pare down the options that Peter referred to. And there was an interesting moment that we came across in the as we prepared the reconstruction that appeared Sunday before last in our paper, and there was a similar one in the Post, where the President had asked the Office of Management and Budget to come up with a price tag on General McChrystal's proposal from August, the one that we all read courtesy of Bob Woodward. And they came back and said that if you did everything that McChrystal asked for, it would be $1 trillion over 10 years, which is a good round number because it's roughly what the healthcare program would cost if you sort of average the different estimates that you see around. They also circle right around $1 trillion for 10 years. And you could imagine a presidential speech that begins, my fellow Americans, I've had to decide whether to spend this $1 trillion on Afghanistan or on the future of American healthcare. And when you start writing the speech, the decision sort of begins, and the narrowing begins right there. The Oslo speech was quite different. There, you saw the president choose from a number of different philosophies. And it's the reason that I say that I don't think we have yet seen a doctrine. He let out, as one category, a continuation of Bush-era unilateralism. He said, and I don't think the Nobel Committee had necessarily expected to hear this speech, or this part of the speech, he said, let's face it, there are moments when nations have to go to war. I'm elected as the commander-in-chief and the defender of American interests, and there are some situations in which I will commit troops. And he said that Afghanistan was an example of where he did that. So he's left one category for unilateralism. He then very carefully laid out a set of issues, a much broader set of issues, where he said the world had to go work together. And he put into that global warming, obviously not something the U.S. could do unilaterally, but he put containing nuclear threats in that category, the ultimate national security problem. And so confronting Iran, confronting North Korea, confronting proliferation, and his list went on. And then he also discussed re-empowering international institutions, the United Nations, by implication the IMF and the World Bank, although he did not talk about those. He was not very specific about how those institutions would be re-empowered. Just one or two last points. Peter mentioned ideological hegemony, a big issue in the Cold War. I don't think a big issue in Obama's vision of what he needs to be doing next. I think that his effort to try to restore American credibility has been to go back to very much a pragmatic, easier to understand, more international set of rules, and thus his discussion in the Oslo speech of just war theory, something that has been discussed in many societies and many places. And a last point, as part of our reducing commitments that the President has discussed, he has not only limited this, of course, to the military, but what's fascinating about Afghanistan is he has limited the American commitment to nation building. And as we were working on the reconstruction of the decision, one of the questions I asked, to be deliberately provocative, was of some White House officials, isn't this a return to the campaign theme in 2000 that President Bush had laid out of not involving the U.S. military in nation building? I was assured that, in fact, it bore no resemblance to President Bush's 2000 campaign pledge. But, in fact, in limiting the American role in nation building, something that you would think the President's constituency would be very much in favor of, President Obama has made it fairly clear that his view is that the U.S. limitations on its power are such that not only can the U.S. not afford to be the world's policeman, but it cannot afford to be the world's rebuilder as well.
I think it's also interesting that there seems to be a conscious decision that the U.S. can no longer afford to be necessarily the world's moral voice, in the same way that it has been in the past. I mean, as much as we associate President Obama domestically with civil rights and with hope and raising discourse to a more idealistic plane, there's been a lot of notice of the fact that the so-called freedom agenda and the emphasis on human rights has been a little bit lacking in this administration, perhaps as a correction to what was perceived to be the sort of misappropriation of this agenda under President Bush.
I'd note that anticipating this panel, the Secretary of State just gave
right.
a speech this afternoon on human rights. So,
okay, so just when we thought we figured it
That's
out.
right.
I think, Glenn, you can add a lot to this conversation because, as has been noted, journalists and think tankers and editorial writers are in despair about the absence of total clarity on what the magic formula is for the approach to the world by this administration. You actually travel with the practitioners of our country's diplomacy, covering the State Department, and I'd like you to get your thoughts on whether, as you travel with Secretary Clinton, you sense that there is a deliberate attempt not just to deal with emergencies on an ad hoc basis, but whether there's a kind of a worldview that is being brought to bear on the world. And we've talked mostly about approach to one particular conflict, but I think part of the attempt is to figure out if there's some approach that you could apply to unforeseen events and some of the problems out there that aren't necessarily front page news. I mean, during the Clinton presidency, there was a sense, even though it seemed like we had an administration that was very much reacting episodically to events and intervening in Kosovo but not in Rwanda and et cetera, and trying to figure out the post-Cold War world. I think everybody did have a general sense that President Clinton had an idea that globalization was good, that the outside world presented an opportunity more than a threat, and there was a very serious economic component to Clintonism, and even though they never quite figured out what the right slogan was. But talk to us, Glenn, about how Secretary of State might see herself, and to the extent that you talk to the people in Afghanistan and in whether it's in the government or elsewhere, and Iraq, and do they sense that the U.S. is kind of winging it, or do they feel that this is an administration that does have a coherent worldview and a so-called doctrine?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, I would just try to separate it a little bit. I mean, first of all, I think that when we look back at the end of this administration, I'm not sure that we'll ever see a Obama doctrine or any kind of overriding philosophy, because I think what you have in this administration is a bunch of extremely pragmatic, for lack of a better word, realists who look at each problem, somewhat in isolation and attack it on those grounds. And they're reasonably flexible in terms of changing, the rationale or the position for why they're doing something, as David was talking about, changing the war in Afghanistan from a war of necessity to something less than that. And it's very much in keeping not only, I think, with the way Obama looks at the world, but also the way Hillary Clinton deals with things, the way Robert Gates looks at the world, the way James Jones, the National Security Advisor, looks at the world. There's not any kind of overriding theme, though at first, I think, at the beginning of the administration, there was a bit of an anything but Bush approach to foreign policy, which I think got them into some trouble at first, because there were a lot of moves that we're going to close down Guantanamo, even though we don't know how we're going to do it. We're going to make these symbolic gestures on torture. We're going to appoint a Middle East envoy and send him out around the world without actually having a plan for how he's going to achieve what he's doing. But this is different. The Bush didn't have a Middle East envoy. He didn't have a plan for Afghanistan or Pakistan. We're going to put a plan. Now, if you go back and rewind or go back and look at where we are now from where they started, you see that a lot of things that they ran out of the box starting to do, they've backtracked on, they've fallen short of, they have recalibrated, and I think that says something to their kind of pragmatic way of looking at the world, and also a bit of reality hitting them. And then you were, in terms of Secretary Clinton, so I've been told that she is actually in the meetings often over at the White House saying we need to have more strategic planning, we need to think more clearly about where we're trying to go. I don't think that they've necessarily done that to any sustained level. I don't think they've had a chance to think in those terms. I think that you see in the president's speeches an effort to try to make some of these connections and to try to sketch out a lodestar of where they're going. Or today, the secretary gave a speech on human rights. This was, I think, and it's actually a very good speech, a very learned, thoughtful speech, which is in many ways a reaction to the incredible criticism that the administration got for their earlier approach to human rights, which again I think was a little bit of anything but Bush. Bush was for human rights, so we're going to be very standoffish on it. I was with Secretary Clinton when we were flying to China, and she kind of announced, without thinking much about it, that we can't let human rights get in the way of how we're going to deal with climate change or the economic crisis. And after being roundly beaten up by the human rights groups, they quickly retreated. And now, 11 months in the administration, she's actually come out with an approach to human rights that I think most human rights groups would feel very comfortable with.
Well, I think you're introducing a useful note of skepticism about the real desirability of having a so-called doctrine. And those of us on the sidelines tend to see it as sort of a failure of conceptualization, and traditionally commentary on presidencies associates ad hoc approaches to things as a sign of disarray or weakness. But I think you started off by pointing out that there might be some benefits to resisting that lure and being pragmatic and not having a straitjacket.
Well, I mean, it can be a straitjacket. I mean, in the Bush administration, I don't think it's greatly appreciated, but there's a big difference between the Bush administration first term and the Bush administration second term. But the Bush administration first term, they got so stuck in, rigid lines that we can't do this. We cannot talk to the Iranians unless they, do this or do that. And a lot of what Obama has been trying to do over the last year is, kind of wipe away all those rigid lines and be relatively accommodating with the rest of the world. And, try it out. Well, we'll reach out to the Iranians for a year, and if they reach back, great. If they don't, then at least we've proven to everyone that you just can't possibly do it. Whereas under the Bush approach, he never forced the Iranians to make a choice because he wasn't even going to talk to them in the first place.
And I guess the Vietnam War itself would be a cautionary tale about with tidy theories and concepts like the
Domino
domino theory and containment can get you into if applied too strictly. Peter, I wanted to I'm giving you an opportunity to plug your upcoming book a bit and your thinking here, because on the one hand, I think we tend to associate and to attribute Bush's, the zeal of Bush's, war against all enemies all the time, axis of evil, and as you pointed out, taking on every anti-American group in the Middle East simultaneously. We tend to attribute it to sort of an overly simplistic, black and white approach to the world. You're with us. If you're not with us, you're against us, etc. At the same time, though, as you've pointed out, in your timepiece, 9/11. As shocking an event as that was, and as devastating it was to our sense of our society as somewhat infallible, perhaps, it did come after a string of remarkable successes throughout the 90s. And to what extent do you think that the kind of reflexive approach to that and what became the Bush doctrine of taking on all these groups and all these countries simultaneously, to what extent do you think it had to do with the sort of hubris of the record that we had accumulated in the 90s, where it didn't seem like there were any limits? As you've written about, from Panama to Gulf War I, Kosovo, it seemed like we could do it all.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this ties into this idea of doctrines. I mean, my own view, what I try to argue in the book, is that doctrines generally start out life very small. There's a kind of analogy the way people operate in investing in a bull market. Even if you go to Wall Street, Las Vegas, you have a certain idea, and it works. And then the more it works, the more self-confident you become, and the more it grows. So, I mean, we tend to think of George Kennan and containment. Kennan hated doctrines. Nothing made Kennan more upset than the idea of grand universal doctrines. He didn't see containment that way at all. What he saw was he had a particular strategy, not for dealing with communism. He didn't want to contain communism. He loved the idea of aligning with Tito against Stalin. He wanted to contain the Stalin-Soviet Union at one regime at one very particular moment in time. Once Stalin was gone, he didn't even want to contain the Soviet Union. It was a very limited thing, but over time, because it was so successful, containment grew and grew and grew until it was a global doctrine in which we were committed to stopping any communist movement from taking power anywhere in the world. I think, in a way, although it is convenient for liberals like myself to draw a very hard and fast line between Bush and Clinton foreign policy, that it makes more sense for me to think about post-Cold War foreign policy similarly to the growth of containment, to a kind of to climbing a ladder. In that this is the dynamic with hubris in foreign policy, that basically certain ideas that emerged as really as small ideas at the beginning of the Cold War grew and grew and grew because America had such extraordinary success. So that the confidence in American military power grows and grows and grows. There are a couple setbacks in the 90s, but basically, I mean, Ronald Reagan won't even invade Panama. Ronald Reagan is too afraid. The political climate in the United States, even in the end of Reagan administration, is so influenced by Vietnam that Reagan refuses to invade Panama. Then Panama works. Then the Gulf War is a big step up. Then the Clinton administration goes through its own slow process in which, by Kosovo in '99, it's far more self-confident about intervening militarily than it is in the first couple of years of the administration. And I think the perceived success of Afghanistan in the beginning is basically another push to people who say, no, our military force can actually do remarkable things. It can solve big problems. And you also have this rising economic self-confidence that results that comes from the overcoming of the Clinton-era deficits. Really, the Reagan-era deficits, such that Dick Cheney can say, I mean, he actually says, right, deficits don't matter, because basically we'll always overcome them. Spend whatever you need. Our economy is so strong that we'll overcome the deficits in the future. And I think ideologically, America grows more and more self-confident in the post-Cold War era gradually, that even if we don't understand a lot about a society like Iraq, we can take as an article of faith that basically people in a country like Iraq want liberal democracy, and they can probably achieve it. Because after all, look at how liberal democracy is spread in all these other parts of the world that nobody thought would ever be able to. And I think that what Obama is dealing with now, it seems to me, is the most difficult thing, in some ways, the most difficult kind of presidency you can have, which is a presidency where you have to essentially try to communicate to the American people that actually America can't do everything that we would like to do, that there are really severe limits. Because I think we have a political culture in which you're supposed to say officially, the path of least resistance is to say, we're the United States, we're optimistic, we should be, if we put our, we put our shoulder to the wheel, we should be able to achieve, to fundamentally transform the world. And I think that, I find the human rights criticism of Obama, frankly, somewhat frustrating. I mean, first of all, they tend to assume that the Bush administration achieved a lot on human rights. I didn't actually notice that the Bush administration achieved a lot on human rights. The Bush administration made some very powerful, eloquent statements on human rights. But I think it seems to me one should be measuring outputs, not inputs. And secondly, the Obama administration, the relationship with China is completely different than the relationship was 10 or 20 years ago. And Obama, I think, has the difficulty of trying to communicate that. I mean, I remember in the early 90s, we were talking about not giving China most favored nation status. Right. I mean, there has been a profound change in the dynamics of this relationship, as unpleasant as it might be for a president to have to tell the American people that.
Well, and even there, they're struggling to come up with the right label. I mean, I think the latest one was strategic reassurance.
Yeah, so I think
the relationship with China.
I think it's really unfair to I don't want to sound like an apologist to the Obama administration, but it's really unfair to judge them based to compare them to a baseline at a time when the perception of how much economic and military and ideological power America had vis-a-vis its major competitors was simply quite dramatically different than it is today.
But would you say it was justified then to have a rather muted response to, say, the protests in Tehran in the aftermath of what seemed to be a rigged election?
I can't really answer that question because I'm not enough of an Iran expert to know whether, in fact, it would have done good. I mean, I think one could reasonably say that there are certain moments you need to know a lot about what the opposition in a country wants you to do, right? Do they even want you to do this? And to know maybe now it makes more sense to beat the Iranians over the head because we don't believe we can negotiate with them anyway. So, but at that point, it was reasonable to think, why beat them up? We actually think there may be some opportunity for diplomatic.
Well, let's let David be our Iran expert for the day.
You're in trouble.
And it's funny because the president had a very forceful statement in support of dissidents in Tehran in Oslo. 6 months on, but at the time, he certainly took a lot of heat for what was perceived to be a muted response. So I want to give you the chance to respond to what's been said here, and also if you could at some point interject a note of sort of economic policy, and this is a subject that you have I've long admired your writings on, and is there something of an Obama economic doctrine in terms of its relationship with the outside world that might be emerging or that needs to emerge?
Well, let me start with Iran before we get to the economic policy, because Iran is an example of what happens when some of these cross currents hit. As Glenn pointed out, Iran was a case where the Bush administration in its first term basically took a regime change approach, though they denied it at the time. By the second term, did sort of a half withdrawal from that, saying that the United States would engage with Iran if Iran first stopped enriching uranium. And when the Iranians refused to stop enriching uranium, that was sort of the end of that effort. The last 2 years were spent spinning wheels and building up frequent flyer miles in a tremendous number of meetings in which the president would not budge. So President Obama went into his opening months of Iran policy persuaded that if he made a bona fide effort to engage the Iranians and continued that for a solid year, then if he got to the moment of sanctions, the moment that we have just now arrived at, he can make a case more convincing than President Bush ever would have been able to make, that he tried a solid year of real offers and got rejected at every point. And his theory was that that would bring the Chinese and the Russians, who were most reluctant on this, around. Now, I don't know about my colleagues on my left and right here, but I'm not yet willing to go bet a month's salary that the Chinese and the Russians are going to come around, even having made these.
Particularly the Chinese.
Particularly the Chinese. The Chinese get about 15% of their oil imports right now from Iran. So do the math on the Chinese economy.
And their investments. I mean,
and huge investments.
Invest in refineries and what have you.
Now, to your point, Andreas, on why the president did not say much during the protests, and certainly they did take a lot of heat for this. Their explanation, I'm not saying that I agree with this or disagree with it, I'm just passing on what, as a reporter, I got from them at the time. The president had just been in Cairo. In Cairo, he had just acknowledged, without apologizing for it, that the CIA's involvement in the 1953 coup in Iran was a mistake, for which we have paid now for more than 5 decades. So I think that his advisors believed, and he believed, if they were being straight up with me, and I'm sure on this point they were, that if the president said too much in support of the protesters in the streets, it would play right into the hands of the government, which was looking for any evidence to show that these protests were American-inspired. And you'll remember that Iranian state news media made that argument even in the absence of any evidence that it was. So I think that their caution was born of not giving the Iranian government the weapon of saying that the protesters and the Americans were acting in a coordinated way. And that's why I think the president waited until the Oslo speech to make the statement. What we're looking for in the coming year is whether or not the president stays with his campaign commitment that the United States would never allow Iran to develop a weapon or even a weapons capability, or whether, as many suspect, the administration is going to be forced to a position of containment in Iran. Classic containment, making the argument that as long as they have not actually screwed a weapon together, you could contain Iranian power. The difficulty with this approach is that the American interpretation of what you can accomplish with containment and the Israeli interpretation of what you can accomplish with containment are radically different. And one's view of this tends to be circumscribed by the missile range of a Shahab 3. And, you know, the further you are out of range, the more enthusiastic you can become about containment. So that is the big struggle of the next year. On economic policy, I'm not sure, again, that we have seen a doctrine, but we have seen an instinct that I find fascinating. The G7 summit, something that Glenn and I have dined at quite well over the years in many different locations, and is basically going to be reduced now to a dinner. And it's going to be the dinner ahead of the G20 meeting. And this decision was made in Pittsburgh on the same night that the news of the secret Iranian plant was breaking. So it, I think, merited almost 3 or 4 paragraphs in my newspaper and probably about similar play in the Post. But it's really a fascinating...
I'm more into tear
well,
when I saw that.
Right. Well, you know, just think of it, Glenn, as an invitation to dine in 20 countries instead of just 7. Okay.
But you're going to get some better food out of it.
That's right.
India,
or at least
Mexico,
more exotic. Yeah.
Brazil.
So the bottom line from that is that I think you can say that when President Obama came to office, he looked at a structure in which we were expecting the 7 European and Canadian and Japanese economies all together to manage a world economy while freezing out China, India, Brazil, and many others. Looked at this and said, it simply won't work. And this economic crisis was the perfect example of it, where the most important driver of recovery have been the Chinese. So I think right away, in terms of institutional change, that may be the biggest and the most important.
If I could just follow up on that. I mean, one thing that does strike me about President Obama's approach to foreign policy is the notion of investments. He seems to be willing to invest a year in reaching out to the Iranians. He seems willing to invest in, moving to a G20 structure is certainly a nod to the Chinese and to the Indians. That's, a bit of an investment, and it's interesting because the Bush administration in particular, when they made gestures like that, they always wanted to have a return right away. They wanted to know what the exchange was going to be. If we do this for you, what are you going to do for us? And President Obama seems quite willing to just make a gesture and see if it will pay off over time. I mean,
certainly, the decision on on the missile system in Poland would also
that's a
qualify.
very good example. Here's one which I don't think has gotten much notice, but the United States has paid all its dues to the United Nations this year. But the Bush administration would always say, "All right, we're going to pay our
Chinese
dues,
money, but
right. But we're going to pay our dues. But what are we going to get from the UN, when we do this?" And in this case, the United States has paid the dues to the UN. I'm not sure what we've gotten yet from the UN, but it's just a kind of an investment. We're going to make these gestures here and around the globe, and I think we'll have to see at the end of 4 years what kind of return he gets from that.
Yeah, that's a great observation, and it circles back to Peter's point about solvency and needing to kind of replenish it before you can then go out. You need to sort of regain leverage. And, I mean, what's happening in Afghanistan is a case in point where, Peter, you talked about in your article about the fact that we've never been weaker in that part of the world, in the last decade or so. And so, in a sense, the administration feels compelled to double down on, you mentioned the Las Vegas doctrines. We can talk about that later. But, they feel compelled to double down on Afghanistan before they can then have a withdrawal that's on our terms, that you negotiate. And, we need to sort of toughen up as well and regain some credibility before we can get the deal from Iran that we want and such. So, at what point, though, are Obama's constituents here and abroad going to want to see the returns on these investments? He took a lot of criticism too for the decision on the missile system in Poland because Putin didn't the next day sign on to everything he wanted, and there's a sense of, well, where is? I mean, Bush used to talk, in his Texas bravado way about how I don't negotiate with myself. Yeah. But so what are these medium-term investments or long-term? When do we see the payoff?
Well, I think that's what's politically perilous about Obama's situation, is that it's obviously there's no guarantee that there will be payoffs. I mean, it may be, the harsh reality may be that that we have to basically that the payoff we get from giving in to China on various different things is that they keep buying our debt. So, that's actually a pretty big payoff, but we don't factor that in. I mean, we take that's the ground level. And so, I mean, it depends on how. I think it goes back to this question of whether the Obama administration's perception of where American power is in the world. My sense is that amongst foreign policy elites, there's more of a recognition of the shift in relative power than there is among the American people, and that is a very, very perilous gap to have, and it's very reminiscent of where we were in the 1970s, which is why foreign policy, domestic politics of foreign policy in the 1970s were treacherous, were deadly for Nixon, Ford, and Carter, because essentially they were all grappling with this. So Nixon essentially launched détente with the Soviet Union. Because we were in a weak position. We were desperately hoping the Chinese and the Soviets would try to kind of pull our bacon out of the fire by getting the North Vietnamese to allow South Vietnam to live. In fact, the Russians didn't do that. The Russians didn't stop meddling in the Third World, and we had no leverage to make them do that, which was what allowed Reagan and the neoconservatives of the 1970s to say, "Look, Nixon's giving away the store for nothing. We're not meeting with Solzhenitsyn. We're not attacking the Soviets on human rights." And Carter had the same problem. And Carter, I mean, there's a lot of I'm surprised in some ways conservatives have not made more of the Carter analogy, because actually if you look at the beginning of the Carter administration, right, 6 days in, he withdraws U.S. troops from South Korea as a kind of gesture to the Soviets. And in the conservative story, basically the Soviet Union says thank you very much, and basically goes on to invade Afghanistan and become more and more aggressive in the Horn of Africa, in Angola. That's the very difficult position that Obama's in. I think that there is, I think to go back to David's point, which is really, really important, one of the most fundamental things I think about the decision that Obama has made or not made, and the decision the entire American kind of the Democratic Party has made, is we still Bush decided, as David said in 2002, that we live in a world in which deterrence no longer applies, not just vis-a-vis terrorist groups, vis-a-vis states. Now, deterrence had pretty broad bipartisan appeal. We swallowed the Soviet Union getting an atomic weapon in 1949. We swallowed China getting a nuclear weapon in the early 1960s, despite the deep conflict we were in with those regimes. And we said we're going to deter them. Bush said, no, deterrence doesn't work anymore. The Democratic Party has never challenged that idea. Obama has never challenged that idea. So, and it seems to me that's what David was rightly getting at about this question about Iran. If you're not willing to use military action, and it seems to me I can't see any evidence from that the Obama administration wants to use military action against Iran. And as David pointed out in that, the most important piece of reporting I think that came out of the Bush administration, even Bush wasn't willing to use military action. And yet, you're not willing to go to, it seems to me sooner or later, Obama may be in the position where he has to go to the American people and say, you know what, I actually disagree with Bush. I actually think that deterrence can still work in various circumstances. Here's why. And in fact, you could argue that in the India-Pakistan relationship, we have some actually quite interesting evidence.
But he's been so absolute that this is not going to be allowed to happen, right?
Well, but if you can't, you can't both be absolute. You can't quite both be absolute that we're not going to use military action and that we're not going to around unless you get very, very lucky. And I think, as David said, we may not get that lucky. I think that the debate about deterrence, it seems to me, was quashed in 2002 and needs to be reopened in a more robust way. I can understand that technically there might be a cost in bringing it out because you don't want to admit failure. But it seems to me that the fact that no Democrats are willing to talk about belief in deterrence anymore, it seems to me a really remarkable fact about the hold that Bush thinking still has on American foreign policy.
Just to interject here, I think that, and this is going to be, in some ways, it may be out of Obama's hands. I mean, he can talk about deterrence, but that is not going to affect the Israeli calculus. And the way the Israelis look at it is that if you attack Iranian facilities, you might only gain 2 or 3 years, but that's enough. That's important. I mean, the way the Israelis look at it, when they attacked the Iraqi facilities, the pilots before they took off asked, "How long is this going to get us?" And they were told 2 to 3 years. And in fact, Iraq never acquired a nuclear capability because they were set back and then set back, and history marched on, and there you are. Iraq never had a nuclear weapon. And that's a very important history lesson for the Israelis, who are sitting here waiting to see what Obama is doing with the outreach and with sanctions. But at some point, the Israelis, Obama may not want to do an attack, but the Israelis may make that calculus. And the fact of the matter is, the United States in the region will be blamed for that attack, whether or not the United States has anything to do with it.
But and to that point, to you and David, do you feel that the Israelis could really do this without the U.S. signing off?
Well, I mean, they're all. I mean, you could send the biggest problem, as I understand it, though I'm no military expert, is that getting those planes back after they've dropped their bombs and being able to the best way for them to get back with the amount of fuel they have is over Iraq. Now, are you going to be? What would be the president's reaction if he got a phone call from the Israeli prime minister who said, "I just want you to know we've destroyed the facilities in Natanz and Iraq, in Iran. The only way our pilots will get back alive is if you let them traverse Iraqi airspace." What would be your response,
David?
This was, in fact, exactly the position that President Bush found himself in May of 2008, when the Israelis came and asked for the bunker-busting weapons and for the overflight rights over Iraq and for the refueling capability in case they wanted to take out Natanz. And I don't think, and didn't argue in the inheritance, that they were planning to do that at the time, but I think they did anticipate that whoever would become the president next was less likely to give them permission, so they might as well try to lock it in early. And one of the astounding things is that President Bush didn't give them that permission, which was pretty remarkable coming from the president who made preemption the centerpiece of American national security policy. That said, one could overread the lessons of both the destruction of the reactor in Iraq in 1981 and the more current lesson, which was the Israeli attack on the Syrian reactor in 2007. And in that case, the Israelis had come and presented the evidence to the United States. There was extensive discussion about whether or not to go to the United Nations, as Secretary Rice and President Bush wanted to do. The Israelis said, thanks, we've been to that movie before. It's called Iran. You end up with 3 or 4 years of continuous resolutions while the construction goes on. And one day, they simply did attack it. Now, a much easier attack. An above-ground, undefended location that one could get to from Israel and back in an hour and a half. All of those situations do not apply in Iraq's case, where you have, in Iran's case, where you have highly distributed nuclear set of facilities, including the Qum facility that is not yet up and running, but was evidence of how little we actually know about where everything is, and where you have a government that learned the lessons of these previous attacks very well and has built a lot of tunnels. So I think that's going to be the much bigger challenge. And it's going to be an interesting test of President Obama's influence. I wanted to just back up on one point that Peter made that had to do with influence with the Chinese. Peter rightly pointed out that among foreign policy types, there was a sense of how much the power has shifted, and that out in the country, I think there was probably less of a sense. I got a vivid lesson in that this past summer, covering the thrilling U.S.-China strategic dialogue that took place here. Several of you may have missed that, and you didn't miss much. But there was one interesting moment in it when during, at halfway through these sessions, and these are meetings between the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Treasury, and their Chinese counterparts, the Chinese asked if they could have not one, but several briefings on the healthcare reform plans. Now, this is not because the Chinese were deeply interested in the public option or not.
They want to know how
they were outraged by the death.
Right.
They were outraged about the death penalty.
That's right.
This is unconscionable.
They weren't really sitting around, Andreas, concerned about whether or not you were going to be reimbursed 80% or 60% by the New America Foundation's insurance company. They were interested, of course, in what the effects of this were going to be on the deficit, and thus how much of it they were going to go finance. And I think when the moment of this shift in power will become evident to the American people is that moment, if it ever comes, when they realize that in something like health care, you first have a vote by the House, and then you have a vote by the Senate, and then you have a conference committee, and then the president signs the bill, and then you have a meeting in the Great Hall of the People to decide whether to fund it. And, you know, it's not going to play out quite that easily, but in essence, the Chinese have to make a decision in the future about how heavily they're going to go invest in American securities. And if they don't invest as heavily, and I don't think they're going to withdraw all at once, there will be some imperceptible initially and maybe perceptible over time effect on interest rates. And I don't think that we've gotten to the point in this country yet where we have recognized that deficit spending on this scale over this period of time invariably gives a vote on your domestic policies to those people who are funding it.
And we have such a and the extreme partisanship of the debate means that I think it makes it very difficult. It's just, I think, extremely difficult for Democrats, even though Democrats know how serious these deficit related issues are, to be told by Republicans that they can't do things that are very, very important to them, when the Republican Party basically did whatever it wanted and paid no attention to this. And so I think that we have a political climate in which it's very, very difficult to basically to deal with the kind of concerns that David's raising.
Yeah, but I think, and David is right, we haven't quite internalized what it means to have the Beijing have sort of a veto power on our domestic
or if Beijing says, you know, what you guys need to do is raise taxes in order to pay for your deficits.
I have like 20 questions that I'm dying to ask all of you, but and time is flying by. But in the interest of opening this up, I'm going to go ahead and take some questions. Everybody should be mindful that you know, you're on camera and this is on the record, and so be provocative and say something crazy, and identify yourselves. So why don't we start at the front here? Yeah.
David, you talked about the Chinese economic power. In the last campaign...
Could you just identify yourself?
Oh, my name is Oda Aberdeen. In the last campaign, we talked about independence from foreign oil. After listening to you, it seems we're more dependent on foreign capital. And the U.S. would have to deal with two challenges: dependence on foreign oil and dependence on foreign capital. These are serious consequences.
And interrelated, because as we've already said on the case of Iran, the Chinese have a certain set of interests about how they want the Iran confrontation resolved, or how they don't want it resolved. And some of their leverage in dealing with the United States and other countries on this comes from the fact that they are now, right now, at least for this moment in history, the capital exporter. And that's just a fact. You know, you can't run $3 trillion in deficits and depend on foreign financing of that and not over some period of time begin to give a bigger and bigger voice to your lender. And, you know, if you went to expand your house, particularly in this environment, the bank would want to go take a look at your architectural plans to make sure that you were building something that was within your income means to pay back over 15 or 30 years. And I think that we're facing a pretty similar, pretty analogous kind of situation at this point with China and with other lenders.
On the second row here. And also wait for the microphone, please.
Spurgeon Keeney. I wish the panel members would comment on Obama's emphasis in his Nobel speech on the concept of just war. This would seem to be an umbrella for preemptive doctrine, preventive war doctrine, nation building, or anything else that the United States felt was in its interest or in the interest of world community in our eyes. Because he made a major emphasis on this, which I think is unique in recent presidential discussions of this subject.
Glenn, you want to start?
Well, I'm thinking that, you know, he did earlier describe Afghanistan as a war of necessity, which I think, you know, gets you in the direction of a just war. I mean, I did not read that. I mean, I didn't listen to his speech. I had to read it because I was overseas last week. But I didn't read that section of the speech as a particularly, you know, overbroad sense that would allow the United States to do whatever it wanted under any circumstances. I think he was trying to ground it in a limited way in order to justify the fact that he was fighting these two wars while accepting the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah.
I think he was doing something a little different than that. I agree with Glenn. I don't think he was using just war theory to explain that the United States could do whatever it wanted. In fact, I think he was using just war theory to say that there are certain types of wars that the United States should be fighting and intervening, and certain types that it should not. And without saying so quite explicitly, I think he was refining his accusation against President Bush for conducting a war that he viewed as a mistake and perhaps as unjust. And here it's useful within just war theory, and I confess that I haven't read Michael Walzer's book since I was compelled to as a college junior, and found it pretty good, and did pull it down from somewhere in the musty stacks of my basement after the president's speech. But in just war theory, there is preemptive war, which is a war that you fight when you see troops massing up against you, and there is also defensive war after you've been attacked. And I think what President Obama was saying was the fight against al-Qaeda was a fight in response to 9/11, the argument that Peters made in this piece that you may have picked up outside about the Obama Doctrine. Preemptive war in its classic version was, you see the troops on the other side of the river and you fire first before they can invade. Preventive war is very different. That's when one state is strong, another is weak, and the strong state attacks the weak state because of fear that one day that weak state could grow stronger without imminence. I think what the president was saying was that was the war that President Bush started against Iraq. And when we would go to write stories about this in 2003, a time when most editors and most in the American public were not really interested in the distinctions between preemptive and preventive war, the answer that we got back from Condoleezza Rice, Glenn's subject in his great biography of her, was that the New World required a new definition because you couldn't always see the attack that was coming the way we didn't see 9/11.
The mushroom cloud.
The mushroom cloud, right. So she came up with the phrase anticipatory self-defense, which indicated that it was sort of in a halfway house between preventive war and preemptive.
I think that's really important. And I think, two interpretations of what Obama was doing, which try to build on what David is saying. The first is, there was once a time in American history where there was a deep moral stigma associated with the idea of preventive war, because that's what the Germans and the Japanese did. And fascinating, if you go back and read about the debates on the Cuban Missile Crisis, when they talk about launching an attack on Cuba, what ultimately one of the powerful things people say is, we're not going to be like Tojo in 1941. And also the idea of preventive war is very much associated with what the Germans did in World War I. That's one of the classic examples of preventive war. They thought the Russians were getting stronger, so Germany basically pushed Austro-Hungary into this very hard line, basically because they wanted to try to fight a war before the Russians got too strong. I think, in a way, one of the things you can try to understand Obama's doing is trying to recapture that sense of moral stigma that used to be associated in the United States with the idea, which the Bush administration tried to basically to peel away with the idea of preventive war. And I think that's why even the idea of talking about just war suggests that America can do something unjust. And I think that's in some ways more significant than we are giving it credit for. Not just a mistake, not just an error, but immoral, evil. Obama used the phrase at one point, evil, in connection to the potential for American action. And that is such a radical shift, it seems to me, from the worldview that we were in with Bush and Cheney, where when you had Abu Ghraib, George W. Bush's response is, America doesn't do that. This is un-American. Whereas I think Obama was trying, and it's a very difficult thing to get across, because you can easily imagine how much fun Glenn Beck and Sarah Palin would have with it, but essentially to say, no, we can not just mistakes, we can do things that are immoral and evil. And therefore, because we are not angels, because we are not morally superior to other human beings in the world, we should restrain our actions within a framework of domestic and international law, because we know that absolute power can corrupt us, just as it has corrupted the great powers of the past. And I think that seems to me, although I admit one has to read a little bit in between the lines to get to that, I think even raising the question of just war raises a series of pretty profound and questions which are a really quite fundamental shift from the way foreign policy was discussed before Obama took office.
By the way, if you want to read some great essays on preventive versus preemptive war, It's a series of letters between Daniel Webster and his equivalent, the British equivalent. I can't now remember who was writing the other letters, when a group of American soldiers up on the Canadian border got drunk one night and went across the river and burned a British warship. And the British were not amused, and there was a brief period of months where it looked like the War of 1812 might start up all over again, and this led to what became the early definitions of this.
Let's go to the side here.
Thanks. My name's Alex Ludden. I'm the editor of the Washington Quarterly at CSIS. For Peter and for David, let me run an idea by you on sort of the Obama Doctrine. If you split the doctrine into two halves, what the world looks like and how the United States shapes or moves the world, the second half of that, the administration clearly seems to be experimenting with how to mobilize American power. But the first half, the principle that seems to be operating or animating how the administration engages in the world, how it sees the world, is that we live in an interdependent world, and that fundamentally limits American power. Is that the operating principle or premise of the Obama administration? And then Glenn, on Iran, very quickly, how do you see Iran's sense of the urgency, Israel's sense of the urgency of the Iranian nuclear weapons program evolving over the last 6 months because of both the political turmoil in Iran and then the technical evidence that the centrifuges aren't spinning as quickly as we might have seen before? There's some evidence that Mossad has sort of changed the time period within which it thinks Iran can actually put a nuclear weapon together. Is there any evidence that in some ways is animating Israeli political circles that might move the time frame for sort of the imminence of some kind of Israeli preemptive action further back next year or beyond?
I think the idea of interdependence or collective security, the idea that we're all in it together, that basically the world is defined more by country, that the foreign policy is not zero sum, that what hurts one country does not benefit another country as much as it also hurts that other country, is probably the core central liberal foreign policy idea in American history. It's the fundamental divide, I think, between basically the conservative and progressive foreign policy traditions. It's basically the centerpiece of what Woodrow Wilson believed. The idea that basically you're all in it together, and the big threats, war, economic collapse, are now environmental collapse. Basically, all countries lose from those. That's why I think liberals so naturally like to think about foreign policy problems that work in a collective security framework, like global warming, where basically no countries really win, but all countries basically lose, and why conservatives dislike thinking about issues like global warming so much, because they feel much more comfortable thinking about zero-sum terms. And so it's not surprising to me that Obama has gone there rhetorically a lot. It's very present in Anne-Marie Slaughter's work. But it's going to be it's the default position, I think, basically for every progressive president to go there. It was muted during the Cold War to some degree because we obviously were in this zero-sum conflict. But even then, the liberals, like Truman and Kennedy in their own way, kept trying to basically inject that notion in. And that's what, and Carter, in a very big way, basically tried to say at several points, look, it's no longer a zero-sum us versus the Soviet world. We now live in a global community. Global community is that kind of like term that liberals love and conservatives hate. And I think it's not surprising that Obama moves there rhetorically. But I think, to go to your question, the problem is that the answer therefore, is, of course, global governance, various forms of kind of institutions that can allow countries and networks that can allow countries to take their common interests and lead to common solutions to problems. The problem is that the model we have for doing this, of course, is the world of the 1940s, a time in which American power was just simply dramatically greater than everybody else. So every other major power was virtually on its knees, and there were a small number of countries that were at the table. And so basically you could do this. You have much bigger kind of collective action problems now with, as David said, as the world of the G20. And so I think it's that tension. And so I find every time Obama gives a big speech, you tend to hear a lot of this collective security language, but with the exception of the G20, which I think David rightly points out is a big deal. In some ways, one of the unacknowledged great accomplishments of Franklin Roosevelt was his decision to put China on the UN Security Council at a time when China had no power. So why is he going to put China on the Security Council? Because FDR imagined that China would have power in the future. It was a brilliant, imagine a world today in which China was not on the Security Council. And so the G20 decision, I think, is a brilliant move on their part in this regard. But it's very difficult to do many others because when you've got 20 countries at the table that are so different, it's a lot harder than it was in 1946, 1947.
Peter's right. Interdependence is, the great rallying call of Democratic presidents over the years. I covered the Clinton administration, or at least part of it, when I returned from Asia, and you couldn't get through a day without hearing the word globalization. And what was interesting when President Bush came in was that you didn't hear the word globalization for about the first 4 or 5 years. As reporters, we always look for that wonderful gap between rhetoric and the way a president is acting. That gap is known as a front page story. And in President Obama's case, the interesting spot of unilateral action is the predator strikes in Pakistan. There have been more predator strikes in Pakistan since President Obama took over on January 20th than there were during the entire Bush administration. It's a pretty interesting statistic. Then you send the National Security Advisor to Pakistan 3 or 4 weeks ago, and as our newspaper has reported, and Glenn's newspaper has reported, his message was, Happy New Year. The president is not going to send 30,000 American additional troops into Afghanistan if they're going to get poached at every day from the tribal areas and from Quetta. So one of two things is going to happen. That those areas will be cleaned out by joint operations between the Pakistanis and the Americans, or those areas will be cleaned out. Now, that sounds a little more like the Bush image of how you go, but Bush never actually talked to the Pakistanis like that, interestingly enough. So that's the tension. You have a president who deeply believes in interdependence and deeply recognizes that for some of the most urgent foreign policy problems that he now faces, Pakistan and Iran being the two, right up there, interdependence, global action, all that, unlikely to work. And that gives me the great ability to actually go listen to Glenn's answer on Iran, because I'm not quite sure how I'd answer that one.
Yeah, I've been puzzling that myself.
I was giving you time.
A lot of time.
Okay? I was dragging it out.
First of all, it's impossible, at least from my vantage point, to predict what the Israeli calculus is going to be. I think a large part really depends on two factors. One is how effective is the diplomacy that's going to be coming ahead in the next year. I can build on what David was just saying. Though we have the United States has tried to reach out to Russia and to China and to get them much more interested in sanctions, the process going forward is not going to spend all that much time at the United Nations, except make a passing nod to it, that the hope and the plan would be that the United States and other countries that are major players in the economic field can really clamp down and cause some pain in Iran. Whether that's going to be effective is unclear. If you get the whole European Union on board, and you are able to effectively target enough of the Iranian elite without necessarily starving the Iranian population, maybe you'll have some sort of deterrence capability on Iran, or get Iran to come moving towards real serious discussions on their nuclear program. If that's not effective, and at the same time it seems like the Iranians are making progress, not only on uranium enrichment, but on other aspects of a weapon. There was a report yesterday in the London Times which suggested that there was more work done on weaponization than American intelligence had thought in the past. That's going to affect the Israeli calculus in another way. So it's the driving force for the administration to be very proactive on Iran and to see that they can make progress is in part trying to keep the Israelis calm about what's going on in Tehran.
I was sitting here thinking that to what you said about Pakistan, David, I remember one of the primary debates where Obama talked about the need perhaps to take unilateral action in Pakistan, and being accused of being naive by Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. So.
And
say what you will.
Who are now executing that.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, say what you will about Obama. I mean, he's the campaign rhetoric is actually there's not that much of a gap.
He telegraphed that, and I believe that Bush started doing that around the same time that Obama.
The President Bush in the summer of 2008 expanded the target list dramatically for the Predator strikes, and that list would appear, just from watching where the strikes happen, would appear to have been expanded even more.
Let's get a couple more. Here along the center aisle. Oliver, right in front of you.
Thanks. My name's Lee Diamond. We've been talking about Reinhold Niebuhr, and so I just wanted to make that explicit because I think that Peter will appreciate this. The humility aspect is important. This sort of restraint that we've been discussing, and I'm reminded of Abraham Lincoln's statement about not claiming that God is on our side, but that we strive to be on God's side. And what we're trying to do is put a few brakes, or just exercise restraint. But we're also talking about world crises, and I think that it's important to exercise all the tools that we have at our disposal. And I really think that we should be finding ways to lean on Israel to, stop provocative activity with regard to the Palestinian situation. So I'd be interested in your thoughts about that, because that could build up our credibility in the region and help us get somewhere, perhaps, with the Arab Street vis-a-vis Iran and other situations.
So it's a question for Peter.
Maybe I'll take the Niebuhr part of it, because although I have a lot of opinions about the Iran thing, the Israel thing, I'd be really very keen to hear, particularly Glenn, talk about. I don't really understand what's happened. I mean, I'm very sympathetic actually to what the Obama administration tried to do, but I don't really understand why. The story about what actually happened seems to me is a fascinating story, and maybe says something about the Obama administration's competence, which I think is something that I'm not the best one on this panel to answer. I think that the most Niebuhrian line was not actually, I think, in the Nobel speech. It was in the West Point speech, where he said America is not as innocent as we once were. And this term innocent has a whole very interesting history, and I think because there are really two understandings of what it means for America to lose its innocence. There are two narratives in which America loses its innocence. The first narrative that Obama was trying to play into is that America loses its innocence on December 7th, 1941. The innocence was the belief that we could stay apart from great power politics, which we tried to do after World War I. And the reality was we were going to have to be involved in, as Niebuhr would say, the necessary evil of global affairs, where we would do evil in the world to prevent greater evil from triumphing. Now, that's in some ways that's the story of innocence that Obama wants to tell. It fits very well with just war theory, but it's also worth remembering that this was exactly the kind of language that the men who brought America into Vietnam were using. I mean, George Bundy, these guys very much thought of themselves as Niebuhrians, as basically people who were saying, look, it's tragic, it's terrible, all these people have to die, but we have no choice. We have to prevent greater evil from succeeding. There is another narrative of when America loses its innocence, which is much more, I think, appealing to the Democratic Party base, and that's that America loses its innocence in 1898. That America loses its innocence when it becomes an imperial power in the Spanish-American War, which is essentially to say, losing our innocence is not something in which we say, well, it's terrible, but we have to do it because there's no alternative. In fact, the losing of the innocence is a terrible, tragic decision we don't have to make, because we don't have to actually be a kind of quasi-imperial power around in the third world. And it seems to me, so the story of Obama talking about innocence may seem very attractive to progressives, but I actually think that it is in some ways really fundamentally different from the story about whether America has to lose its innocence, that is actually much more attractive to the kind of MoveOn.org type.
Well, I grew up in Mexico, and they would say that the innocence was lost in 1845.
Right, and if you want to back it up more, Andreas, I mean, every American president goes through this cycle, and so think about Thomas Jefferson coming to power, thinking that he could run an entirely domestic agenda, wanting to cut off all trade between the United States and the rest of the world so we didn't get wrapped up in this, and he ends up fighting the Barbary pirates. So, we keep learning the same lesson.
Yeah. There's that great line, isn't there the great story from the Bush administration where Powell has this line where he says, America's never asked for any more territory than the amount we need to bury our dead. And then Villepin writes a little note to the Mexican ambassador saying, any comment on that?
It's a lot of burial ground. Glenn, take us to the Middle East.
All right, the administration and the Israeli-Palestinian issue. The instincts of the administration, I think, is quite admirable, which is that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is important to the U.S. national interest. This is something that the president says many times, and he sees it interconnected, as you mentioned, particularly to like the issues like the Iranian question and the U.S. image in the Arab world. And so the Bush administration tended to see them as disconnected, that they weren't all interrelated. But part of Obama's way of looking at the world as all sorts of problems being interrelated, he viewed progress in the Middle East, in the Israeli-Palestinian question, and in the broader Israeli-Arab relationship could lessen the appeal of organizations such as Hezbollah and Hamas, take away one of the tender hooks that Iran has in the Middle East, improve the U.S. image among the Arab world. I think those are all ideas that are quite worthy. I think where they got into some trouble, and I chalk this up to just the beginning of any administration, is that they set up a special envoy, George Mitchell, who a very talented, experienced negotiator, but they hadn't really, I think, thought through how they were going to approach this problem. And part of the reason for having a special envoy was you avoided the whole question of going through confirmation hearings. And in fact, the Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs, it took months for him to get confirmed because of the usual Senate shenanigans. But when you go through that process, it allows an administration to think very seriously about their policy and how are they going to accomplish the goals they've set out for themselves. And it forces, there's a whole process of producing papers. There's a lot of bureaucratic stuff, but I think it's very important for an administration to get its head around a really difficult problem. And the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, of course, has bedeviled every administration since the founding of Israel. And, the initial instinct to say we're going to put pressure on Israel on settlements because settlements is something that is very disturbing to the Palestinians. Again, I think an admirable instinct. But how do you get from that diagnosis of the problem to actually having an effective policy is the kind of question I think only comes about through months and months of discussion and study. And instead they went straight ahead into it without, I think, that benefit. And then compounded it with the kind of rookie mistakes that you tend to make. The president could have said that in private to the Israeli Prime Minister, Mr. Netanyahu, but then Hillary Clinton said it publicly. Said, we want full stop on settlements, no natural growth, no nothing. So once she put it out there in public, suddenly that was the goal. And anyone that knows anything about this conflict is going to realize that you can't, at least at the outset, expect that you're going to achieve that outcome. So immediately there were several they were going backwards because they were set a goal that was not able to be achieved, at least at the beginning. And so when they didn't achieve that and then tried to say that what we did achieve is really significant, by then they'd lost the respect and the trust of the Arabs and the Palestinians, and you're kind of in the situation you are now. And then there were other things, the usual kinds of things that crop up in the Middle East, such as the Goldstone report, which I won't bore you with the details, but it's just one of those things that gets thrown into a very volatile mix that also set back U.S. policy. So there we are. It's a year later. Just quote George Mitchell, who says that when he was the North Ireland negotiator, he had 750 days of failure and 1 day of success. And that's it seems to be the attitude he's taking.
You might actually be missing the baseball controversy, too. I want to try to sum up and allow the panelists to have a final quick thought on, because we opened this with the question, Mark, Obama Doctrine, ? And I think we're sort of gathering that perhaps there isn't quite yet an all-encompassing Obama Doctrine. We've heard a lot about thinking that's evolving and principles that are being enunciated, but maybe not quite an all-encompassing doctrine because the world's a very complicated place, and because we have a set of players that are realists and pragmatic, and also because it's the first year of this administration, and as David pointed out, there was no such discernible Bush doctrine until the end of 2002. And this administration hasn't quite yet had to react to its own time. I mean, it's still dealing with the inheritance. So, you know, I think we're in an early period, and whether a doctrine will evolve is time will tell. But I think it's worth just to sum up, if I could get some thoughts from you all, as to whether it's a worthy pursuit to try to formulate one. We've talked about how those of us on the sidelines are frustrated that there isn't a doctrine that we can support or rail against. We're just dealing with sort of ad hoc reactions. But so I'd like the three of you to talk about, you know, very quickly about if you were advising the president, would you deem it advisable for him and his top advisors to, you know, spend a weekend at Camp David? It's kind of like corporate 90s where everybody had to do a mission statement. But would you advise him to retreat into Camp David with his advisors to try to formulate a Obama doctrine that they can then, you know, present to the world and say this is how we're going to deal with not just the challenges before us today, but whatever comes down the road? And maybe I'm making it too simplistic, but Peter, why don't you start?
Well, I think there's a little bit of a straw man here. I mean, no administration ever has an all-encompassing global doctrine, certainly not for its entire administration. I mean, what basically happens is that administrations do various things, I think, basically, in various different places. And then outsiders, or sometimes insiders, look at those things and say, oh, we can draw a circle around these things and see, we can connect these dots, and here it looks like there's something similar going on. And I think that's the right way to do it, actually. I mean, I think... I think even those connecting dots don't connect everything. They might connect a few different things that are connected to one another. So I mean, I was really talking about Obama vis-a-vis the war on terror in the Middle East. I don't think you can necessarily connect that to what he's trying to do in global warming. So I don't think they should do that. I do think what Obama needs to think a great deal about, and he maybe already is, but is how he talks to the American people about the moment that we're in. Because I think if he doesn't talk, and he's obviously brilliant, he's spent a lot of time talking about to the rest of the world, and I think he's done so very well. But if he doesn't talk to the American people about the moment we're in and how different it is from the moment that we thought we were in a few years ago, I think other people are going to fill that gap in exactly the way they did to Jimmy Carter. Which is exactly what they did to Jimmy Carter. What was Jimmy Carter? Jimmy Carter was the guy who believed America was in decline. It's essentially said this about Nixon and Carter. They've given up on America. We believe in America. We don't believe in this limits nonsense. We don't believe in, we believe that America's best days are ahead of us. I think what Obama has to do is really to preempt that discussion by really trying to engage in a serious conversation with Americans, a series of speeches to Americans about trying to define the moment we're in, so that because I think otherwise he's going to be in a very dangerous place. And I think that what David rightly pointed out is that I think near the core of it has to be a reinterpretation of American history, which goes through the catechism of American successes, triumphs, and tells them less as a story of American military success and more of a story of American economic success. And this happens to be true. I mean, America won World War II because we outcompeted the Germans. Our factories simply churned out more planes and tanks than they did. That was basically always America's strategy, to basically not try to go in. The American strategy was always to maximize our strengths, which were our economic power and our technology, and let the Soviets basically put vast numbers of troops to go toe-to-toe with the Nazis, while we basically tried to leverage our economic power and our technological power. And that's how we won the Cold War, basically. The Soviets had a theory of history that said that capitalism was doomed. We had a theory of history that said that communism is doomed, and we proved it right, not on the battlefield, but by basically economic outcompeting them. That's the challenge now, it seems to me, vis-a-vis China. And in a different and less important way, it's the challenge vis-a-vis jihadism. And I think that Obama has started to tell that story of American success as the story of American economic success, and I think that would seem to me what he needs to say. It's not a doctrine, but it seems to me it's an interpretation of the moment we're in that connects to some of his policies and protects him from some very dangerous political.
So it's the Obama narrative.
I was trying to figure out how you reduce that to the first line of a speech, and I guess it would be Obama to the world. We may be in debt, but we own your Google searches. As you think about this first year, I'm reminded of this great line that Henry Kissinger had to my colleague Roger Cohen a few weeks ago, where he said that watching President Obama, he has the sense of watching a chess grandmaster who has started up 6 games and is moving around the room, doing his moves, and he'd like to see him finish just one of them. Now, it's first year, and I dare say that when Henry Kissinger was both National Security Advisor and Secretary of State all at once, that it took a while to get some games finished, and some that he left are unfinished to this day. Glenn was talking about one of them before in the Middle East. Doctrines are kind of like recessions. You only get to understand where they began and where they end after they're over. And there is a 20/20 hindsight nature to these. And so to your question, would it make more sense to go to Camp David and try to work out a doctrine for the weekend, or go to Camp David and play basketball all weekend? I think the question sort of answers itself. I don't think that one could, in a world where you're dealing with as many disparate threats as this one, come up with a doctrine that really meant a whole lot. That doesn't mean that at the end of a single term, when Glenn and I are called into our respective editors' offices and given those dreaded words, we have to do the assessment of the first 4 years, that we won't be searching to do exactly what Peter just suggested, which is try to take all of these different elements and discern a doctrine from them. That doesn't mean one exists. That just meant that we had the assignment. Okay? And so I think one has to proceed with those with some care. But there are 2 places that I would look for this most strongly. I mentioned one with Pakistan, which is going to be the test of unilateralism versus this more collective instinct. And I think the second, and the one for this year, is going to be the Iran confrontation, because there the president's going to have to make a series of choices: unilateralism versus a joint effort to choke off the Iranian economy. And then he's going to have to make a series of choices about how to go deal with Israel. And he's going to have to make a series of choices about whether he sticks with his campaign rhetoric or can, in fact, revive containment for the very different circumstances of the Iranian nuclear program. And I think by the time we're done with those 2, and I'm assuming that Israeli-Palestinian negotiations will carry on so that our successors will be writing the same stories we've just written, that I think when we're done with those 2, we will be a whole lot closer to being able to answer the question of the panel today.
Well, and just I think that's a great segue there, because the way it works is that it doesn't happen where the president calls someone up, the whole staff up to Camp David, and says, let's think of a doctrine. The president comes up with the doctrine through trial and error and through the real-life events and crises that he has faced. And I think the 2 that David picked there, Pakistan and Iran, are 2 crises that is going to force this president to grapple with what kind of leader is he, what kind of person is he, and what kind of United States does he lead. And the interesting thing about President Obama is that he really, I think he kind of goes through this Camp David experience every time he makes a big speech. And his speeches are really very revealing. I think much more revealing than any other president that I've covered. I didn't think you ever got much that revelatory out of President Bush when he gave a speech. It was there was a lot of cookie cutter stuff there. There was a lot of rhetoric, but it never really added up, I felt, to anything coherent. And with President Clinton, I found the most revealing moments for President Clinton was when he was giving late night talks at fundraisers, where he'd kind of ramble on at 11 o'clock at night and kind of offer these insights where you could kind of see how his mind was thinking. And I used to get great stories out of reading those speeches and seeing what was on his mind. But this president really, and maybe it's because he's a writer, in fact I would say he's probably a better writer than any of us sitting up here, that he looks at these speeches as an intellectual exercise that lets him think through the problem that he is grappling with, and you can see how his mind works. And so you have, I really don't think there's, at the moment anything that could be called an Obama doctrine. I'm not sure we'll see something at the end of his term, but you can get a real understanding as to how he approaches the world through these speeches. Because and I think it's very different with this president than some of the more recent presidents.
That's a great point. I want to thank all of you for coming and the panelists, and thank all of you who caught this on the New America website and also on the Washington Note. And thanks to Steve Clements for streaming it there. Hope to see you again soon. Bye.